Well, the book of Exodus provides the most reasonable explanation of that. Well, I could go on. There are fact after fact in our modern world which have to be accepted as facts for which you've got to find an explanation. And to me, the book of Exodus gives the best explanation of all the facts. Well, now let's run through the sections of this book and look at some of the points of interest. I can't give you a commentary on the whole book. I just want to take out of each section something that might have troubled your mind or some question that you might ask and try and give you an answer to that. Let's take multiplication and murder. The question that I have is, why did they stay so long in Egypt? 400 years. They went down there in the time of Joseph and Jacob, you remember, because there was a famine and Egypt had bread. And they simply went down there because there was more food. They went voluntarily. They were accepted as guests of the government. They were given a jolly good fertile piece of the Nile Delta called Goshen. And there they were during the 7 years of famine. But at the end of that time, why didn't they go back to their own land? Why did they stay? And in fact, they stayed so long that they outstayed their welcome. And that's when they were forced into forced labor. So why did they stay? Well, there's a human answer to that and a divine answer. And I'll give you both. Because so often there are two sides to every question. The human answer is they were jolly comfortable. It was much easier to make a living in the Nile Delta than it was on the hills of Judea. Much easier. And it was fertile. The climate was warmer. There was no snow in the Nile Delta. There was in the hills of Judea. They were just altogether more comfortable in much the same way as Lot was more comfortable down in the Jordan Valley at Sodom and Gomorrah. The climate was very similar to the Nile Delta, and it looks more comfortable. And people like to live in a more comfortable climate where life is easier, and that's why they stayed. Though God had never given them any land in Egypt, he said, I'm giving you the hills of Canaan. That's where you belong. But they stayed. Well, we can't blame them because we tend to do the same thing. And they didn't want to leave until it was too late. Amazing how many Christians find a new house before they start looking for a church or start asking how they're going to serve God there because they've seen a house that they like. See? Well, that's what they did. And they stayed in Egypt too long until it was too late and they weren't free to leave. And they were now in the position of being forced labor. That's the human answer. And then, and only then, they cried out to God and say, God, why are you letting us be slaves in Egypt? Isn't it amazing how we get ourselves into problems, and then we start blaming God for not getting us out of them quickly? It's so human. But God didn't do anything about it for 400 years. And we've got to ask, why? Had they gone back as soon as the famine was over, there would have only been a few people. And there was room for those few in Canaan. But now they had stayed so long that they were a large people, and there was no room for them in Canaan because there were already other people living there. Now God was going to kick those people out, but not until they were so wicked that they didn't deserve to live there. And God explains in the book of Genesis even, he explained to Abraham that your descendants will stay in Egypt a long, long time until the wickedness of the Canaanites is complete. And so before God could empty the land of the Canaanites for all of them now, he had to wait until they became so bad that it would be an act of justice and judgment to throw them out of the promised land and let all the Hebrew slaves in. So God waited until he could do that. And that's the reason God gave for that 400-year gap. It's a long time to wait for God to answer your prayers. You pass it down the generation. Keep asking God, and one day He'll get us out of here. What patience you need to go on praying that. 4 centuries. But God heard. And at the right time He acted. Well, now they had gone through 3 oppressive decrees. The first was forced labor. Second was to make bricks without straw. Do you realize what that meant? Have you ever lifted up 2 bricks, one made with straw and one without? The one without is about 3 times heavier. See, the more straw you put in, the lighter the brick, and the easier it is to carry. But bricks without straw, that's heavy. And the Egyptians thought that if they did this, then they wouldn't have any energy left for leisure, mischief, or sex. That was the idea. And so that they'd be too tired even to make love, and therefore the numbers would go down again. In fact, the harder the conditions they made for the Hebrew slaves, the more children they had. So they had to introduce a 3rd decree, and that was that all the baby boys had to be thrown in the Nile to the crocodiles. The Nile, of course, is the source of life to Egypt. There's no life apart from the Nile in Egypt. But it was also the place of death for the Hebrew slaves. Well, now, that's the first section. Bulrushes in the bush I don't need to say much about, except to point out that Moses, like Joseph, was brought up in court. C-O-U-R-T. And therefore was given the best education. If ever you go along the Thames embankment in London, look for Cleopatra's Needle. There are 2 of them. One is in Rome, the other is on the Thames embankment. And those 2 were the gateposts of the Egyptian university. And when you see Cleopatra's Needle, you're looking at something that Moses saw every day as a student. He walked past that and had a university education. This, of course, made him far better educated than any of the Hebrew slaves. And this, of course, is why he was able to write the first 5 books of the Bible. And it says he kept a careful record of everything. And he collected people's memories. And he put together these 5 books. His education as an Egyptian prince was not wasted. But, of course, all that came to a sudden end when he lost his temper with one of the Egyptian slave drivers and killed him and had to flee for his life. Interesting then that he actually spent 40 years in the very wilderness where later he would have to live for 40 years with the people of Israel. So that again God prepared him for this. I don't know if you can do this, but I can look back on my pre-Christian days and see God preparing me for what happened. I remember going in for speaking competitions in the Young Farmers Club, little dreaming that in doing that, God was getting me ready for what I do now. And God got Moses ready for leading his people through the wilderness by making him spend 40 years there by himself, being a shepherd, looking after a few goats or sheep. But then he murdered the Egyptian guard. The burning bush is very interesting, not so much for the bush as for Moses' excuses. God called Moses out of a burning bush and said, take your shoes off. You're on holy ground. And then he said, now Moses, you're going to be the man to draw my people out of Egypt. You were drawn out of the Nile, but you're going to draw my people out of Egypt altogether. And Moses made 5 excuses as to why he shouldn't do it. And again, you might identify with one of these. First, he said, I am insignificant. Who am I that anybody should take notice of me? Have you ever said that? Well, God said, I'll be with you. Who am I? I'm the important one, not you. So he tried a second excuse. He said, I'm ignorant. What shall I say? And God said, I'll make you a promise. I'll tell you what to say. So he made a third excuse. He said, I'm impotent. I can't convince them. They won't believe me. And God said, my power is going to be with you. You're going to do miracles. Then he said, I'm incompetent. I'm not eloquent. Actually, I had a stammer. He said, I can't put words together. Did you ever say that to God? And God said, all right, your brother Aaron will be your prophet. So that tells you what a prophet is. A prophet is simply someone who's a mouthpiece.